welcome everyone to our second webinar of the year entitled Rights, Justice, Action for All Women and Girls, Reflections and Practice on Feminist Participatory Grant Making. We are the EADI Gender Justice Working Group, and we are a group that is under construction. We are a vibrant global community of feminist researchers, practitioners, and activists committed to transforming gender power dynamics in development, research, and practice. To discover more about our work, you can check our LinkedIn page where we regularly post updates about our activities. And you could also subscribe to our Gender Justice Lab newsletter where we deliver the latest research, actions, and innovations advancing gender justice. We will be sharing the link to our LinkedIn page in the chat box. I am joined today by my colleague Daniela Pardo Yepes, our working group's co-convener, and Ana Carolina de Paula Romano, Senior Executive of the European Association of Development Research and Training Institute, or EADI. I will also be joined by my other colleague from the Gender Justice Working Group, Vicky Page, who will help us in moderating the Q&A part later on. So just a quick reminder, everyone, uh, for our session for today. So that's the EADI Gender Justice Working Group. Next slide, please. Thank you. So once again, may I remind everyone that this session is being recorded and it will be available on EADI's website and YouTube channel, as well as EADI Gender Justice Working Group LinkedIn page. If you have any queries or comments, please use the chat box to introduce yourself, share comments, or post useful links. And I would also like to request everyone to keep your camera on to interact with our panel and to please keep your microphone muted when you're not speaking. Next slide, please. Thank you. So for today, we're going to have a very interesting topic, and it's all about feminist participatory grant making and philanthropy as a whole. So decision making in grant making processes is often done in closed boardrooms, far away from communities that are at the forefront of intersecting crises. Traditional grant making usually follows a top down approach where donors, often from the global north, decide what the objectives and impacts of a given program will be and who will be the main beneficiaries of the funds. This often protects the status quo, sidelining those who are most impacted by socio-political issues and funding cuts. Despite this traditional approach, more and more international non-government organizations are challenging the status quo by providing them with grants and resources to advance their causes and fight for gender justice through feminist participatory grant making, or FPG. Joining us today to enlighten more about this very interesting topic are Erika Mandresa Sales of Mama Cash and Jessica Horn of Moleskin Foundation. Erika Mandresa Sales is a feminist activist from the Philippines. She is a strategist with over 18 years of experience. She began her journey to social movements, working in feminist research, advocacy, and cross-border campaigning before moving into feminist philanthropy and grant making. She supports movements across the Asia Pacific and globally through strategy development, partnerships, and resourcing. She currently works with Mama Cash and has previously worked with organizations including the Global Alliance for Green and Gender Action, Asian Pacific Resource and Research Center for Women, Greenpeace Southeast Asia, and the Dawn Feminist Network. Across these spaces, she focuses on redistributing resources more equitably, strengthening movement ecosystems, and building partnerships grounded in trust, care, and feminist values. Our second panelist is Jessica Horn. She is an East African feminist, idea monger, futurist, and strategist with 20 plus years in philanthropy and work for social change with a feminist vision. An innovator by inclination, Jessica pioneered the African Women's Development Fund's Future Initiative and contributed to the design of FRIDA and UHAI EASHRI, early models of participatory grant making. In 2021, she became the first African woman to lead the Ford Foundation in Nairobi. Trained in women's health, trained in women's health rights, she served on the Lancet Commission on Gender and Global Health. Jessica is the author of African Feminist Praxis, Cartographies of Liberatory Worldmaking, which explores generations of African feminist organizing. Once again, Erika and Jessica, thank you for joining us today. So, thank you. Yes. So, to kick off our discussion, my first question to both of you. How does the current socio-political how does the how does the current socio-political climate relate to the state of the funding landscape? Hello, can you hear me, Jessica and Erika?
Sure. We just weren't sure who you'd like to go first.
Oh
Yeah,
yes, you can start, Erika.
yeah, sure. Yeah, that's a big question, but I'm here to share my thoughts. So, this is also something we often discuss at Mama Cash. So, the current socio-political context, um, yes, as you know, it's so many things happening at the same time. So there's inequality, there's wars, armed conflict, and almost closed already, but we call it shrinking civil space, digital repression, backlash against gender, social justice movements. All of these, we continuously learn from the movements that we support has a direct impact on funding landscape. So there are funding cuts, and if there's even funding available, those are becoming more and more restricted, risk averse, and most of the time just available tied to specific regions or issues or time bound projects and concentrated or accessible to larger established organizations. What we are also seeing at Mama Cash as a trend globally is that there's an increasing and worsening anti-civil society policies and laws that are just making it more difficult for feminist activists in different regions to access funding. What does this mean? In different countries, there are legal and financial regulations. It can be multiple in one country. And this is just presenting barriers to the activists themselves. The restrictions complicate processes of transferring funds, especially to informal, unregistered, or exclusive or excluded groups who need this funding the most. And because of these barriers, they're often navigating um, hierarchies, bureaucracies, extra paperworks just to make it almost impossible to access any funding if there's anything available. Linking this to feminist participatory grant making. So feminist philanthropy and participatory grant making is emerging as a not emerging, like it's already been happening many years, but it continues to be a response to these challenges that we have, because what it really challenges is this traditional, as you said, this traditional top-down funding models, by shifting power and decision making to the communities most affected by issues. So for Mama Cash, it's the women, it's the girls, it's the lesbian, bisexual, trans, queer people, um, intersex people that we support. And in this context where political pressure limit those who gets funding and how, these approaches of feminist participatory grant making prioritizes trust, long-term support, and equity. I guess I just wanted to also say that feminist participatory grant making is really pushing is for more core, flexible, inclusive, justice-orienting funding practices. So, for example, at Mama Cash, we recognize that fundamental change does take some time to happen. So we support groups for the longer term, often for a trajectory of around 10 years. So as a feminist fund, we provide core, flexible, long-term funding and also offer adaptive accompaniment, which includes organizational strengthening. And this is on top of the core flexible funding, also networking, alliance building, fundraising support, different types of accompaniment that respond to the group's needs. So I just want to tie, this big socio-political context to the funding landscape. So as Mama Cash, as the largest participatory grant maker, respond to all of these challenges by doing the funding that we do.
All right. Thank you, Erica, for sharing your thoughts. I want to hear your thoughts now, Jessica. What can you share with us about it?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And just to say, firstly, that I am a senior fellow with Moleskine Foundation, so I'm not part of their grant making, and I'm speaking very much more from just the experience of working in philanthropy for many years. So I think it's interesting to zoom out a little bit to ask the question of who funds feminist activism anyway. The Association for Women's Rights and Development, I think it's about 20 years ago now, realized that we're always talking about funding crisis, but they wanted to quantify it. And so they started this survey of global feminist organizing, which they continue to this day, called Where is the Money? And what was very interesting in the initial research, which actually hasn't shifted much, is that the majority of financing for feminist activism comes from us. It comes from other feminists. And actually, 81% of feminist and women's rights and queer feminist aligned organizations globally, 81% rely on autonomous funding. And then women's funds become a very important source of external institutional funding. So in women's funds like Mama Cash. So the large scale funding, which is what it tends to be directly affected by these large geopolitical shifts because there's shifts in aid, there's shifts in donor priorities, it actually only accounts for a relatively small section of the money that actually goes to feminist organizing. And also it tends to be the larger organizations that get hit by that. Of course, it trickles down because many of the women's funds rely on bilateral money. But it's just interesting to think about that. We're already funding basically the ones who fund our own activism. And part of the problem has been that, this is a question of gender justice, and the work that feminism does is for humanity. It's not for a small group of people somewhere, it's for all of humanity. And it remains shocking how deprioritized it is in funding streams. And also just to say that what's interesting is that OECD DAC, I'll put some links in because I know a lot of you are researchers or, looking at the kind of technical side of this. The OECD DAC actually, as a result, in the Where's the Money process, started to produce then actually Where is the Money for gender equality in the OECD DAC, and have a whole dashboard, and they track it, including money that goes to women's and feminist movements and organizations, which is great. But it shows that actually even when money is given, it tends to be to almost stereotypical areas. There's money to civil society, money to reproductive health. And then you get into infrastructure, trade, mining, water, energy, right? And there's basically almost no gender equality funding. So, it is a big problem in some respects, but also in a way, we were hardly funded. And so I think that's also kind of fascinating. And I'd love to, for us to think a little bit about where else could the money come from as we move through this conversation.
Right. Thank you for your sharing. And it's actually fascinating to learn that uh majority of funding when it comes to feminist movement actually come from women's feminist women's movement itself. So now that given the current global developments, like, so I'm gonna segue with the, how do donors and funding agencies decide which programs to support, and which types of programs do they prioritize, and which they tend not to prioritize? I can, yeah, Jessica, you can also you can start with it.
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting question. So, a lot of what happens in gender financing happens around the whatever established global goals exist. So, it's the SDGs now. Basically, funding trends are shaped by a couple of things, but including advocacy. So, what feminist movements and organizations manage to push at a governmental level and intergovernmental level will often then become the priority for what is funded. You'll notice that sexual and reproductive health tends to be almost synonymous with gender equality. So that's the one thing when people say, oh, we're doing gender, they will do that. Obviously, like I said, there's a whole range of other things that need attention. Women's labor, where do women fit in trade policy? Where do women fit in macroeconomic policy, right? Where does questions of feminism, it's not just women, but also gender nonconforming and the whole question of gendered power, where do those fit, right? In infrastructure. It's critical in expanding urbanization and thinking about the design of cities, right? All of these things in tech. And so we tend to be tagged on as an afterthought. So you can usually rely on the SDGs as one marker. And then when you get into private philanthropy, there's usually kind of a variety, but a lot of money goes into sexual and reproductive health and justice work. And again, I think that there's a lot of kinds of work that tends to get left out. Like I said, this macrostructural peace and security, actually, it was sort of on trend for a while when people were doing, UN Resolution 1325, etc. And now it's sort of, it's hardly on the radar. These things tend to go in and out. Arts and culture, where's the money to support our archiving and our history? I mean, there's many things that need to be done. But they tend not to be there unless, again, there's, private philanthropy or women's fund takes up an issue, but it's rarely at the scale that's needed. So it is critical for us, I think, when we're pushing for increased gender justice funding, I think we ourselves actually need to come back and take a look at what it is we're asking for. We actually need to ask for a full range of resourcing, and we need to ask for full integration into every issue on the table, as opposed to just pigeonholing us into these questions. I come out of the sexual reproductive rights movement, but I do think it's a very narrow frame, because that's not all we do, and that's not the only question that gender power poses in society. And so I do think we need to really push hopefully a rebuilding of support for the justice agenda more globally. We need to push for this expanded frame, women in politics. Like, there's so many questions of things that we need to think about.
I totally agree with you, Jessica, because every gender issue intersects with one another. Like SRHR intersects with climate justice. I work with in the intersections of climate and gender justice, and given from my work, there's an increase violence uh being experienced by indigenous women and land defenders. So everything, this issue intersects with one another. You cannot leave one issue behind because they're all interconnected. And I would like to hear your thoughts about it, Erika.
Yeah, yeah. As you said, I just listening to all of you. I just listening to you, Andy and Jessica. I just remember my interactions with activists themselves. Like, how we try to always categorize, and we like discussing themes like HR or climate justice groups. But when we ask those who are really doing the work, if they're working on women's rights or environment, they're like, it's both. But for us it's categories, but it's the donors, or those who are discussing at the high levels, who like to do this, who like to categorize, who like to label. But yeah, like, if you really look at how the lives of the communities, it's really all interconnected. Like, they live in the land, they are mothers, they do care work, and they need, yeah, so they do farming, so it's like everything is tied to each other.
Yes, I agree. Like when we cannot talk about gender justice without delving in these issues, SRHR, GBVs, climate justice, environmental justice, LGBTQIA rights, they're all interconnected.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So moving on, this is Erica, you can start with this one. So now that how are feminist movements and organizations around the world respond to these challenges? What mechanisms do they activate to secure and sustain funding? You were mentioning about Mama Cash program on core flexible long-term funding. Can you expound more on that?
Yeah. Um, yeah, I can expound on that a little bit later. But to answer your questions, like what are we learning from the groups we support and also from our peers, and what we do as a feminist fund. So how are we responding? It's really yeah, it's a mix of adapting, like adapting to the situation, but also trying to do innovation and doing things together. So this collective action that we all do. So first, there are many who are at this time who are strengthening solidarity and collaborations to yeah to address the challenges. So there are coalitions, there are regional funds, there are networks that are sharing knowledge and also advocating collectively for more and better money. So right now Mama Cash is part of this global campaign with Alliance for Feminist Movements, for example, also and also collab. It's about raising 600 million USD annually for women-led movements. So it's this bigger networks coming together. It's just an example from the Mamaka side, but you can also see this in other regions. Second is um yeah, because this conversation is about feminist participatory grant making. There's this continuous active engagement in this model. So this emphasis that if you want to solve the root causes of the problems, you have to involve those who are there because they know the solutions. No, they live the situation, so they have to be involved in the funding decisions, and you have to ensure that it really reaches those who are underrepresented and who are there in the local communities. Um, what else? Third, I hear this from the groups we support. Like there are attempts to diversify sources so that you don't solely rely on traditional donors or just have one donor like Baba Cash. So many are exploring community-based fundraising, mutual aid, individuals giving, even earned income like managing your own farms, developing your own economic units in your provinces, so and developing your own training. So groups like local group, I'm talking about the local groups that we fund, the feminists in different countries. That and also building partnerships with other sectors and allies. So there's a lot of this experimenting because yeah, because it's very difficult, and you see people coming together helping each other. The other thing that I want to raise and also to ask your to respond to your question, Anna D, about this core long-term flexible funding. Another thing that to address this challenge is to continuously do advocacy towards donor. So at Mama Cash, we call this like influencing the philanthropic sector. So with peer donors, we always do influencing for them to provide more flexible long-term funding and just move beyond the short-term project-based grants. Um, yeah, when we say more what we do when we influence is not just say we need more funding, because more funding can also be more problem, but it should be better, more and better. Better means it should be yeah flexible, it should be long term, it should actually reach the activists, the groups. No, that's the better funding that we talk about. What else? Another thing that we are also emphasizing to the groups that we support, but we also see many feminist groups investing in more, is sustainability strategies beyond just funding, so that even if you don't have money, you are still happy and healthy. So, for example, prioritizing care and well-being, making sure you support the succession of your leadership. You have yeah. So that what else? Having having a space to breathe and rest and retreat. So it's also those things that are we see are being shared more, and also the things that we are supporting for the groups.
Thank you, Erica. I really like when you mentioned that, you know, more money doesn't mean better funding. So we really have to think it very well how to fund our programs. And I like that you emphasize about care, well-being, rest, and breathe, because feminist movement and activism is ongoing and long term, and sometimes it we can get really inundated by these issues that are really pertinent and soul crushing. So it's really important that we prioritize care, well-being, rest, and just to breathe every now and then. So and what about you, Jessica? What can you share about us?
Sorry, can you just repeat the framing question?
Yes. So uh how are the feminist movements and organizations around the world respond to these challenges? Like, what mechanisms are they activating to secure and sustain funding?
I mean, to be honest, it's a difficult time. They call it a polycrisis more generally, but I think for organizations, again, one of the problems is when your fund dead and then your funding disappears overnight, you have to retrench people. You have to close down in some cases, right? I mean, it is an acute crisis. Right now, many organizations are facing an acute crisis. And I do think that it's a lesson because for a long time, we've all been saying to each other, we need to find alternatives, find alternatives. And in a way, people didn't build a buffer. Some of it was because it was hard to, because many donors don't allow you to build reserves and all of that. And there's a reason for some of that, like the way that people, well, that sort of formal organizations are funded can in a way be unsustainable because it doesn't allow you to build a buffer for when times are hard in your budget. But also, I think that there needs to be some learning from the bigger organizations to these smaller initiatives that have been able to crack autonomous funding. Autonomous funding is, in some respects, the gold. It's like if you can figure out how to finance your work and not be dependent on people, isn't that a feminist thing? Independence, autonomy, isn't that that's kind of and again it gives you a buffer that allows you to wiggle, and to move when things get tough. So I think I'm not gonna sugarcoat and say it's easy. I think, like I said, in the formal organizational space, it's really, really hard. People have had to cut and people are losing their jobs. Some organizations are closing, they're having to narrow programming. And that comes along, layered onto what Erika was talking about of the reality of increasingly hostile operating environments where people are, being criminalized for doing things that are ultimately defending rights. So, and make also very difficult kind of increasing control of how money flows, which can affect sometimes as well-meaning resources as well. So I think it's a challenge. I think it's actually a crisis, at which is good because when you're in a crisis, you're then learning about the things you didn't do so well, right? And so I think we need to pay attention to that and properly learn and really think about how even donors giving, is it just more budget or is it giving in a different way? And like I said, in a way that is more sustainable. Imagine if there was more 10-year funding and some of that funding could actually go into ways to make all of these initiatives more autonomous, right? And self-reliant and have some kind of buffer endowments or, any reserves, things that allow the organizations to exist without constant dependency in the 1, 2, 3-year donor cycles.
Thank you, Jessica. Yeah, if we can only have autonomous funding for all large and small organizations, that would be great. So we can continue capacitating our partners and strengthening movements, especially on the ground. That would be awesome. But I know that given what's happening with the world, it's increasingly there's increased hostility with social movements. I really want to know what's gonna happen next. So moving on, what is your forecast for feminist funding from 2026 and beyond? You can start, Erika.
Sorry. It sounds like can Jessica start on this first? I just really need to respond to my child.
Okay, sorry, no problem. Go ahead, Jessica.
I understand that feeling. They're always there. Mommy! Um,
I agree.
yes. So, I mean, this is a very interesting question. So, like I said, I think we kind of segued into it. I see that there is going to be a reduction. There has already been a reduction in money coming from governments as governments move towards the right. The right wing has never supported gender justice. So, there's going to be a restriction, increasing restriction with money. Any new right-wing government that comes in is going to restrict development assistance, is going to restrict gender justice money. That's just almost a given. And philanthropy is all over the place because depending on where that philanthropy is based, in some cases, people feel like they can't do these side fights, as it were, anymore, and they have to focus in on, the big thing of democracy or what have you. Again, I think there's a good opportunity and a vital opportunity here to make the case that gender justice lies at the heart of democracy, and we've seen that. Um, um, it's kind of a case that's been proven. I think it's a moment to really, like I said, focus in on these models of autonomous financing and how people have managed to do it and think about how to scale that. And I actually think it would be a good pitch, to different kinds of donors. It could be to your classic philanthropies. It could also be to investors, to any other people with money who want to give, to say, help us scale. This means that we have autonomous financing and make it into something that could generate even more, right? To be creative. There's this phenomenon called the Great Wealth Transfer. It's largely focused on analysis from the US and some parts of Europe, it's kind of a global north thing. But this idea that there's an estimated 84 to 124 trillion dollars in global assets that's going to change hands from like my parents' generation, basically, as they pass away, into their children's hands, right? Trillions of dollars. And they say that the majority of that money is actually going to be passing down to women. And so a lot of people are looking at that and asking the question of that's a massive opportunity. And again, we can't make any assumptions about the politics of the people, inheriting, but there surely are some amongst them, who believe in gender justice, and how is that an opportunity? But I think in doing so, again, to continue to encourage and shape a different kind of giving. I do think it's very interesting to see how the Mackenzie Scotts have entered the picture. She's not really necessarily the pioneer of her approach. There are institutional donors who are actually doing similar, just not with so much fanfare. But I think it is interesting to see what she's doing. And in a way, Mama Cash has been saying that for a while, right? A lot of the kind of the Black feminist funds similarly are saying, we will give once we understand your mission aligned and, we trust you basically to do this work. And we're going to give you enough money to be able to just take it and run, right? Flexible and really to determine the priorities yourself. So I think there's really a chance to kind of encourage that kind of new philanthropic actor to think differently about how they fund and to intervene in that way. So it is a tough time. And like I said, I think there's an acute crisis, which I don't think is going to go away in the next year. And there's going to be some hard decisions and difficulties. But I do think it's an opportunity to rethink in a way, because we've gotten into a rut that didn't work. Right? It didn't work. It wasn't actually giving the money that people needed. Everybody has budget deficits. Everybody is operating on budgets that are insufficient for what they need to be doing. And it's short term, it's, admin heavy, it's insufficient support for overheads. All of that didn't actually work. So in a way, maybe what is dying is a broken system. Maybe that's okay. But I think to very tactically, proactively think about what it is we're trying to replace that with and make sure that that framing is very, very clear so that these opportunities can be harnessed, but they actually do the thing we want, right? So yeah, those are my thoughts.
Thank you, Jessica. I did not know about the great wealth transfer that will happen in the next generation. 124 trillion US dollars, and most of them are gonna be passed down to women. So I really hope that there is an opportunity for that to uh to overcome this crisis, and there will be an opportunity to scale, and so that feminist movements will be able to do and capacitate other movements in a more sustainable fashion. What about your thoughts, Erica?
I just want to because maybe I'm sure I missed it. So this is like money being passed to women and when
Yeah,
is
it's
this
being
happening, Jessica?
inherited.
Yeah,
It's
Being
inherited.
being
Yeah.
inherited.
inherited.
It's being inherited.
Ah, that is
Because there's a
interesting.
generation of like the baby boomers and what have you, and they will pass away. And so this is inheriting land, property, investments, etc. And that's the estimation of how much is going to be changing hands. So it's a huge
Yeah,
amount of, yeah,
that is
There's an
very
opportunity there.
yeah,
yeah. And
that's in
I think it's an estimated 70% will go to women. So
yeah. That's interesting because just to share a bit of Mama Cash history, so it also started with an inheritance. So one lesbian inherited this big amount of money and sat down. The story is they sat down in the kitchen, five of them, all lesbians, and decided we want to use this to support women across borders, and that's not happened in the past. And they just it's just women gathering in together to do some change, but it also this inheritance and this money that they use to share and yeah, I don't know, it's just interesting when I heard that from Jessica. So to answer your question about the forecast, um one of the things we are also discussing at Mama Cash, which we are also telling people that we cannot ignore it anymore, is how it's how very important to support security um, and digital rights, not only for groups who are already working online and on digital rights, but for all groups. I mean, nobody. What is it like? All groups now, at least the ones that we support especially are not like are affected in some way because of the government surveillance and online threats. So I think so the question is feminist funding, right? Like 2026 and beyond. So I think there would be more focus and also like just priority for this, prioritizing digital safety, secure communication, and protection for activists, operate safely. I think that what else? That's the first thing that came to mind. It was already mentioned by Jessica, like other forms of giving, because at Mama Cash, of course, with all of the funding cuts, we were very much affected. Like two strategic partnerships had to end because of the funding cuts of the Dutch ministry, but that doesn't mean there are no new sources of funding. So there are also individual women giving to Mama Cash and also other groups, other bilaterals. I'm not other bilaterals, like individuals. I mean, yeah, I think those two. There are questions in the chat.
Yes. So thank you, Erica and Jessica, for sharing your expertise about this super interesting topic. So before I proceed to the Q&A question, can we have a photo op with everyone?
Oh,
This is voluntary, so if you don't feel like showing yourself, it's okay. But I'm gonna ask my colleague Danny to take some pictures for documentation purposes. Are we ready, Danny?
Yes, we're ready. But also asking if you can also turn on your cameras. So when we have the question and answer part, we can also the speakers can also see who is here beyond just like a webinar and a conversation. It's also the people that are interested in these topics. So that would be great. But well, here we go. Okay, let's see if it works now. Usually works. Okay, perfect. So I'll take a couple because we have 2 screens. So let's see. Okay, 1, 2, and 3. And let's try the other screen. There we go. And hold on. There we go. 1, 2, and 3. Thank you so much. Stay tuned. we still have some questions.
Yes, thank you once again, Jessica and Erica, for joining us. Now we're going to proceed to our Q&A section. And if you have any questions, feel free to put it in the chat box, and my colleagues Vicky and Danny will read it to us. Do we have any questions?
Yes, we have 2 questions here
Yay.
at the moment. So I'll read the first question from Irma. So Irma asks, where do you see the biggest gaps between what feminist movements need and what feminist funding institutions currently provide? And in a context of shrinking funding space, how can feminist actors strategically position their work without losing their political vision or being sidelined by issues that are often seen as more fundable? Thank you, from Irma. Do you want me to go on to the second question, or should we take a minute to respond to that one?
I think we can take a minute to respond to that one.
Great.
Jessica, Erica, who wants to answer?
Sure, I can go ahead. So I think we'd name some of the gaps in how the money's given. So this issue of obviously work on gender justice. I mean, gender injustice is a historic phenomenon, right? It's existed for literally centuries, and so it's not going to go away in 2 years or with a 6-month grant. So there is no way. If you're investing in this, it has to be a generational investment so that you can see transformation. And so there's one problem, is that the funding is short-term and sometimes incredibly short-term to the point of almost being ridiculous in its length. So that does mean that you're constantly stopping and starting, but also that you have a huge amount of administration tied to it because you're constantly having to renew and report and all of that. So you don't really ever get into a rhythm of just being able to do your work. The second is that it's not adequate. So most feminist organizations report, like I said, a budget deficit in terms of what they actually need to fully implement their work and what they receive. And then it is inflexible. And so, a lot of development assistance, for example, would have a maximum 12% overhead. I mean, at a 12% overhead, you can hardly pay your staff, let alone provide for proper healthcare and, all the kinds of benefits that you would need to be a good employer. That's actually serious because this is knowledge work. And so your staff are critical to it, right? And so, that's an issue. So I think, when it comes to the strategic positioning and the issues, I mean, feminist organizations also need the capacity to do, as Anadi was mentioning before, like work that understands in a more ecosystemic and holistic way what the problems are, right? They're not necessarily going to be in these SDG silos or in these kind of narrow sector-based approaches, and that there also needs to be financing available in all sectors because every issue on the table for humans is a gender justice issue. And so again, the pigeonholing can be quite different and difficult. And I think a lot of people who have organizations with mandates that fall outside of the classic few issues find it hard to get moving. And it's like constantly starting from scratch. So to maintain a political vision can be difficult sometimes, actually. And a lot of organizations do have mission drift because SRHR is on trend with donors, and then all of a sudden climate is the only thing donors will fund. What are you going to do? Like you're just going to say no, or you're going to try and adapt and figure out how you increase your climate competency and apply for the climate money. And I will say everyone else is doing that too, right? Everyone else is doing that too. All of a sudden, I feel like I went to sleep and suddenly everybody's working on toilets. Or is it just me? Do you know what I mean? Like every project is about toilets. And I'm like, what's with the toilets? And I realized, wash became a development priority. And all of a sudden, everyone's doing toilets. And again, most of those organizations were not in the toilet business prior. So, it's not just feminists. But I think the solution to that is core flexible funding so that people can actually pursue the strategies as they deem relevant, as opposed to having to fit in other people's sense of what's important.
Yeah, I just want to share my thoughts. So the gap no between the feminist movements and the actors and what funding institutions currently provide. Like sometimes the bigger institutions or those who have more funding to give, sometimes they see it as a problem or it's very difficult for them to give directly to the feminist activists working in different communities or at the local setting because they like just to illustrate, like they're here and they're there. So sometimes it works to have like another fund working, for example, in the country who is also from the movement, who can receive this funding and regrant. So that could be a model that could bridge the gap. I'm just imagining those things because that's the reason why Mama Cash as a fund also supports other women's funds working in countries in the regions. So we give them the funding so that they can regrant to other groups because you cannot reach everybody even if you want to do that. So sometimes you need a bridge. So that can be one. Because there's that gap that the bridges, the other funds, the other intermediaries could provide that. Although there are some criticisms about that, but we can also say that it's most of the time it works. What else? It's just that to reach the movements, there are just a lot of resources that funders really need to put into, like making sure you're catering to different languages. You have to make sure your templates are understandable, because I remember when I was the former program officer for environmental justice at Mama Cash, when Mama Cash still had that thematic approach. Many of the rural women-led groups and indigenous women-led groups don't have mobile phones, and sometimes they would sit in front of the computer, and the reporting templates, for example, are just in English. So even that, right? So that's also another gap that needs to be addressed. So if you really want to be fair and just in your funding practices, you have to you have to make sure that you're also addressing those gaps. That's it.
Yeah, we can proceed to another. Thank you, Erika and Jessica. We can proceed to the other question.
Great. Yes, we have a question from Daniela, who asks, whose responsibility is it to get private philanthropy to shift funding models to more feminist participatory principles, long-term, unrestricted, relationship-based, etc.? Is it on the donee to advocate, the philanthropic group to self-motivate? I'm just wondering where the positive change comes from.
Who would like to go first? Jessica?
Is Erika speaking? Are you okay?
Erika?
Oh, no, you're
No,
fine.
sorry, I'm trying to read the question.
Oh, yeah, no problem. Okay, so I'll start. Yeah, I mean, I've worked in private philanthropy for a while. The one thing I would say is that private philanthropy is not one thing. It's a whole range of types of giving, from a high net worth individual who has their own fund to an endowed foundation, but it's not one person's money, it's just money that had been gifted and is now in an endowment. And, so that's the MacArthur's, the Fords, the what have yous. There's a lot of different kinds of platforms, right, in private philanthropy. But what I would say first is that actually this idea of shifting to longer term, unrestricted, etc., actually has been anchored in private philanthropy. So the Ford Foundation, for example, started the Build initiative. The board set aside $1 billion on the idea that what organizations need is long-term unrestricted funding. And it was an experiment. Organizations were vetted, and then they got 5 years worth of funding. The only restriction was that you couldn't put it into reserves, but you could invest it in other things that would grow money. It's just that they were concerned that people wouldn't just take the whole lot and, and not actually do something with it in terms of programming as well. And all of the, research showed that it absolutely led to increased financial stability as well as increased program impact. So it exists there. Mackenzie Scott, like I said, came on the back of some of these kinds of initiatives. There is a push for true cost recovery. And again, a group of the large philanthropies in the US came together to push this idea of true cost recovery. So like I said, there's a 12%, 10 to 12% overhead limit in a lot of funding. And the argument was that actually the truer amount of overhead is something more like 25% or more. So how do we encourage organizations to better calculate the actual overhead cost of implementing the work and then make sure that we fund it so that we're not starving organizations when we're resourcing them? So, I mean, there's a couple of ways to advocate. One is that it has to be the zeitgeist, right? So if there is a broad call in all the spaces any donor goes, they're hearing the same message. Obviously, they're going to take it back, right? And say, we need to do something about this. So it is important to keep, going on that point. Second is an evidence base. So it's actually, when we're talking about money is factual. So it's actually very important to have an evidence base. The Where's the Money report and this piece of research that two quantitative sociologists did, actually trying to understand, to look at, statistically speaking, whether progressive women's organizing is actually the enabling factor for progressive gender policy. So that was a Hatun and Weldon research. And they ran data from, I think, about 78 countries and actually found that it was true, that actually the likelihood of having the most progressive policy on violence against women was increased if it was autonomous feminist organizing that was pushing it. And that was more important than having progressive political parties or labor unions or other actors involved. And so this kind of evidence base is pretty thin, but where it exists, it's actually been really influential in making the point. So I think that it's important not to just say it in a narrative way, but actually provide the concrete analysis of how you make what makes a difference. Because again, that also helps people who are allies in philanthropy make a case to boards, who are thinking a lot of other things. The bigger the philanthropy is, the more likely you are to have people on the board who are, finance execs or, people corporate law. I mean, they're not thinking about movements in the ways that we are. So how do you get them to understand what you're talking about? You have to speak in their language, right? And so I think that's also another critical piece of the advocacy. But like I said, it has to be the zeitgeist, and there also needs to be some evidence attached to it to show that what is being said is actually factually true.
Go ahead, Erika.
It's very interesting what you're saying. I just remember reading some briefs that Mama Cash wanted to produce, and I'm like, these are the same groups that I'm supporting, but it's in the language of the target donor. And it's so like there's no justice language of course, right? Like us activists, like we're used to like, oh, social justice and change and blah blah, like there's no mention of that, but it's still it's the groups and what they do, the evidence, but the language is the language. And of course it's going to be used for fundraising purposes or communications, but it can be also that, like, how do you get them to shift? It's learning how they how they communicate, and it's not and making sure that there's evidence that you can back it up. I just want to go back to the question earlier, like how can feminists strategically position their work without losing their political vision and being sidelined. What I've learned the past few years of supporting groups who've changed their priorities and focus because of changing funding landscape is losing sight of their, or not prioritizing so much their work in the movements. So like if you want to stay politically relevant and close to what you said you're going to do and not losing your political vision, it's really being part of the movement. and making sure that you're not forgetting why you're part of the movement and what contested issue you're fighting for, because you can change other things like add programs because the money is there, but as long as you keep that at your core, then you're what is it? What's the question again? Then you're doing the work that you said you do, or your vision.
Are there more questions?
No more questions in the chat.
Thank you. Okay. Wow. Thank you. Once again, thank you, Jessica and Erika, for joining us in today's discussion. We learned so much about feminist philanthropy and grant making. And yeah, despite the challenges that feminist philanthropy and grant making are currently facing, it is still very essential that we continue our work and support of feminist organizations that advocates and empowers women's, girls, indigenous women, trans, and intersex rights. And by providing the necessary funds and resources and democratizing the mechanisms that will allow them to flourish and sustain their work, feminist philanthropy and grant making ensures redistribution of power in decision making and recognition of community based knowledge as a legitimate source of evidence and not just an afterthought. I would like to thank again, Jessica and Erika, for lending their expertise and time for this event. Thank you so much for joining us. And I would also like to thank the Anna and the EADI team for hosting this webinar. And I would also like to extend my gratitude to the members of the EADI Gender Justice Working Group, Danny, Vicky, Kata, Gabby for the promotional materials. They help in developing this webinar. And thank you all for joining and participating here with us. Please do not forget to follow us on our LinkedIn page and subscribe to our monthly newsletter. You can also become an EID member by clicking the QR code and do not forget to subscribe to our newsletter and so that you can stay updated with our latest event. Once again, thank you and have a pleasant evening, afternoon, morning to everyone wherever you are. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye.
Jessica and Erika.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Andy. Amazing host.
Thank you, Danny.